Hi, everyone, and welcome to Spotlight with Scientists in School. On the program today, I have Kumudu Jinadasa. She's a project engineer and a mission manager with the Canadian Space Agency. Now, if you have considered a career in space, this is the interview for you. We chat about moon exploration, space medicine, women in space, role models, and more importantly, Kumi reminds us all that we should spend time outdoors and look up at the sky. It's an interview you don't want to miss, so let's head on over and meet Kumi. I want to start right at the beginning and find out what kind of kid you were. Were you fascinated with science as a child?
Yeah, so growing up, I was definitely that kid that was asking a lot of questions to the point where I think it was a little annoying for my teachers and my parents, but for a good reason. And I do remember as a kid, always being fascinated by birds and airplanes and like how things so heavy and so light could fly and just like the physics behind it. I didn't know the word physics, I
Right.
think, like there being very little, but definitely the physics behind all of that. So I was a little curious kid. Yeah.
I thought so. I thought that would be your answer. I looked up your profile on the Canadian Space Agency, and there's this great quote there that says, "There are so many wonderful mentors in the world just waiting for you." So I think kids would be happy to hear this. Where can they find mentors? And did you have mentors or role models growing up?
I think the one role model I really had came a little bit later on. I was a little bit older. I was about 17 years old, and I watched the Chris Hadfield launch. It was a
Oh,
launch of Canadarm2 on Space Shuttle Endeavour, and Chris Hadfield and Canadarm2 were on the space shuttle together for the commissioning of Canadarm2, which is the robotic arm on the International Space Station. And Canadian astronaut Chris Hadfield was the one, you know, in charge of that commissioning and of that mission. And from that day, after seeing that launch, I mean, Chris was definitely a role model for me, and I would listen to his interviews and read, articles and books. And there's one thing that he said that really stood out to me,
mm,
actually. It still stands out to me today. It was like more of a theme. I don't remember the exact words he used, but the theme was really, at every point in his life where he had to make a decision, he had decided very young that he wanted to be an astronaut. And it was every point in his life where he had to make a decision, he asked himself, is this going to help me to become an astronaut or is it not? And then he'd always choose the choice that would help him to reach his goal. And that applies to so many things. I mean, not just becoming an astronaut, it applies to absolutely any goal that you have. You stop and you ask yourself at a certain point, okay, is what I'm doing helping me reach my goal or is it not? And then always choose the one that's going to help you to reach your goal. But for kids now in elementary school, high school, CEGEP university, you have so many things accessible at your fingertips. You have role models that have these wonderful social media accounts that advocate for science, engineering, technology, and math. The Canadian Space Agency has a great social media presence, a website, and even on the Canadian Space Agency website, there's a section where you can find some of the employees and what they do, and
right.
kind of these role models that are trying to engage with the Canadian youth. I wish I was growing up in this time where we have so much access to people and things, but I definitely feel like having those role models or mentors or somebody that you look up to can really help.
You studied mechanical engineering at McGill University. Then you've worked for like aerospace companies. So were you always interested in flight and space?
Yeah, definitely.
Mm.
So even as a kid, I remember going outside, and my parents lived near the Montreal airport. So there was always
Ah,
airplanes flying by. And that was what I was kind of saying before, how, I would look up into the sky, and I was always just really fascinated by anything that could fly, these airplanes that were so heavy with passengers, with the big seats full of metal, full of luggage, and so heavy, and they're soaring up in the
right.
sky. And this tiny little bird that weighs nothing is also flying, and
Yeah.
the wings, and the difference between wings in motion and fixed wings, on an aircraft, and wings in motion of a bird. So I always caught myself as a kid. Oh, I didn't realize that as a kid, but now I realize I would always like look up to the sky. So it was something that, and it's something that I tell kids now, actually. So when I go into schools, elementary school, even high school, I say, go outside, forget your device, put it down, go
Yes.
outside and go into like an area where there's trees and maybe some squirrels and some animals, like wherever you live, or if there's tundra or if there's prairies, and just go out into nature and stay there for a little while and see what you're drawn to. And that gives you a pretty good idea of something that you could be passionate about. So for me, as a kid, I'd always look up and look at the sky and look at what was flying around, bugs, birds, bees,
Yeah.
airplanes, helicopters. And I still do that now. And it doesn't change. So like
Yeah.
my passion for flight, it didn't change since I was a kid.
Some people, I think, may believe that a career in space industry is just like astronauts and engineers. Are there other careers in the space industry?
Absolutely. So I would say if you are looking for a career in space and you want to, really secure working in space, and definitely STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, that's going to be your way to go.
Mm-hmm.
But there are so many other domains, so many other fields of study in which you can still work in the space industry, and we need those people too. So for example, right now, if you think about the Artemis mission, which is the mission NASA, the European Space Agency, and the Canadian Space Agency, joint collaboration, going to the moon, going to Mars. Well, when we get to the moon, there's also other countries that are going there, and we're going to need lawyers and policymakers and people that work in governance to develop those space policies so that we could peacefully have a presence, a human presence on the moon. I could take any job at all, and tell you how it can relate to space.
You have worked in robotics, and I think the Canadarm is pretty well known. Are there other famous robots?
So we have 3 pieces of robotics that were operational as of right now. So we had Canadarm, as you mentioned. Canadarm was the first generation of the arm, and that was on the shuttle. Then we have Canadarm2, which is on the International Space Station, and that's operational today. And there's also Dexter. So actually, if you look at your $5 bill,
Yes.
there is a picture of Canadarm2 on the mobile base, and attached to Canadarm2 is Dexter. And that's a dexterous manipulator, another robot that has smaller, what I call them, hands to do smaller tasks on the International Space Station. So you can actually see this on your Canadian $5 bill, which is kind of cool. Canadarm has like a bigger latching end effector, which can capture free flyers, which is other spacecraft. It actually captures free flying spacecraft and then docks it to the International Space Station. But then Dexter can be attached to the latching end effector of Canadarm2. And then it has these smaller arms. And the smaller arms have different tools that can actually repair a battery box or repair smaller electronic boxes on the outside of the International Space Station, so that an astronaut doesn't have to go out and do that.
We're working for a group called Astronauts, Life Sciences, and Space Medicine.
Yeah, it's a pretty long, it's a long title there.
It is, but it sounds very cool. What is space medicine all about?
Space medicine is exactly what it sounds like. It's how do we administer medical treatment and medical assessment when the astronauts don't necessarily have access to doctors.
Right.
So it's all the technology that you would need. So when we're talking about the International Space Station, we're still relatively close to Earth. And the astronauts still have very good communication with the Earth. So if anything should go wrong, they could consult with people on the ground. But as we go further and further away, this is where the space medicine technologies are going to become very important. So as we go to the moon, there's going to be a lot of autonomy that's going to be needed in medicine, so that if the astronauts get sick or they need some kind of diagnostic done or some kind of test done, that they're going to be able to do that autonomously without maybe that line of communication with the Earth.
Right.
So there's a lot right now, especially with the Artemis program and the Lunar Gateway, which is going to be the space station that's going to orbit around the moon. There's a lot of medical technologies that are being developed in order to support human life further and further away without the access to doctors and consults and the same diagnostics that we have. You know, here you have strep throat, you go to the doctor, go to the pharmacy, you do your strep throat test, but we need that same technology on closer to the moon, or we need that for the astronauts as they travel further and further. And it's not necessarily the same technology that you'd use on Earth, because you need it to not expire, right? You know, you need things to be viable longer. So how do we do that? How do we preserve the same way of doing things on the ground, but allow that to happen very, very far away, and allow it to be available, ready to use in a more extended period of time.
Now, how long has an astronaut been in space for?
So right now, I believe there was one that was in space longer than 6 months. It was the Kelly brothers. I know he had written a book, and I don't think it was intended that he stayed for almost a year or just a year.
But yeah, around a year time.
But around a year time, but it's not the norm. The norm is really 6 months. That's the longest that they would stay on the International Space Station.
Okay, so let's talk about what are some of the challenges that an astronaut would face being in outer space for an extended period of time. What's happening? What are some of the challenges?
So even being in low Earth orbit, that's where the International Space Station is. It's in one of Earth's orbits, and it's a lower Earth orbit, so we call it LEO, low Earth orbit. It's still relatively close to Earth, but still we see very, very significant effects happening on the human body. And we see those effects in terms of the cardiovascular system. We see them in terms of their muscles, their bones, their eyes, their ears, the vestibular system, which is, you know, if you go on a roller coaster and then you get all dizzy afterwards, well, that's kind of like your inner ear and your vestibular system that gets a little shaken up. But as you can imagine, when the astronauts get into microgravity and they start floating, and then, you know, where's up, where's down, where's left, where's right, it doesn't exist anymore when you're floating. That really triggers the vestibular system. So they have actually a period of adaptation when they get into microgravity. And it's about, I think it's like 5 to 7 days where they experience almost motion sickness. Or some of them do. Some of them experience that. So these are all the effects that can happen just in microgravity. And that's very, very close to the Earth. Now, as we go further and further away, you also, you get more pronounced effects, because you are also exposed to more radiation as you get further away from the protectiveness of the Earth's atmosphere. So on the moon, there are a lot of other technologies that are being developed for radiation protection, the types of materials that are being used. So these are some of the effects.
You're using the word microgravity a lot. So, you know, growing up as a kid, we always said there was zero gravity. That's why you're floating around. But you're using the word microgravity, which, let's explain what that is.
Yeah, sure. So I'm being very specific to use microgravity, especially in low Earth orbit. So the fact that we're floating in orbit, it's not that there's no gravity within the orbit of our Earth. When you get to the moon, then I think we're more comfortable saying zero gravity. But within our orbit, the space station is using thrusters to stay in that orbit. So actually what's kind of happening is almost like a free fall in an elevator. So if you've ever gone really fast from the top floor down, and then you kind of feel like you're floating, that is more what the astronauts are experiencing in low Earth orbit in microgravity than the fact that there's zero gravity. So I think within the Canadian Space Agency and within the space industry as a whole, we use that term microgravity. I think a lot more than in mainstream. Mainstream, I feel like people say zero gravity still a lot, but to be technically accurate, we say microgravity.
Now, these effects that you're talking about, like if you had a plant in outer space, would it also have effects? Or what about an animal? What if you took a dog out there? Would it have effects? Microgravity have effects on those?
Like as an experiment, there are rodents on the International Space Station. And yes, there's experimentation that's being done on them to see what the effects are of microgravity on these rodents. And there's different things, different experiments that are occurring. So definitely sustainable. I mean, it's life. Just like humans, and they need to be fed, and they need to have all the things that they need. And definitely microgravity does affect them. I would think very similarly to humans because they're Earth's creatures. Now, for plants, this is really interesting. So even the commercial industry has kind of gotten in on this and started doing experiments here because plants grow very uniquely in microgravity than they do on Earth. So on Earth, if you pull out any, let's say a weed, you pull out a
Right.
weed, you see the roots are all going down.
Right.
Now, the reason the roots are all going down is not because, oh, the soil's down here, so it's growing down. No, it's because of gravity.
Mm.
That's why the roots are growing down. So in microgravity on the International Space Station, actually Target, the store, sent up these cotton plants in these tubes, like plastic tubes, and they grew seedlings and they observed how the roots grew in microgravity.
Oh, cool.
But there's no presence of that gravity pulling them down. So the roots grew 365 degrees, all different ways. And the seedlings had, so many more roots than on Earth. So it seems like the stress of gravity on a seedling will produce less roots
Right.
and less of a robust plant than in microgravity. Target is using this for cotton plants. They're thinking of the yield of cotton that they could generate in microgravity versus on the Earth. You probably on Earth need a crop that's, this big, but in microgravity, it would need to be a lot smaller. So the footprint is a lot smaller. So you start thinking about, what is the environmental impacts of that? The amount of water that's needed was also less.
Right.
So all kinds of really cool, practical, and even commercial applications.
Can we spend a few moments to talk about Canada's role in moon exploration? You mentioned Artemis a little bit earlier, but tell me what is our role and a little bit about the Artemis mission.
Yeah, so the Artemis mission is our return to the moon after more than 50 years.
How exciting!
This is really exciting. I mean, this was the Apollo era where it was like the space race and we're trying to get to the moon. But now we're trying to get to the moon, not just to go to the moon, we're going to the moon to stay there. So there's going to be a human presence on the moon. There's going to be a space station orbiting around the moon. There's going to be a Canadian robotic arm on that space station. So that's the new generation of Canadarm that's being developed right now. Canadarm3, that's going to be on the Lunar Gateway space station. So we have, a big Canadian presence within this program, within this Artemis program. We also have Jeremy Hansen, who's going to be going up on the next Artemis flight. So that flight is Artemis 2. It's going to be around September 2025 timeframe, and he will be the first Canadian, and actually Canada is the second nation who's going to send a human around the moon. At the Canadian Space Agency, and I think all of Canadians, this is a moment of, pride and just we're in awe, and it's very, very inspiring. I think I really hope that this helps set the tone for the next generation of engineers and scientists and doctors and anyone who's really, if you're thinking about space, this is the time to really get engaged.
When I was growing up watching all movies, about space, and you mentioned Apollo, it always seemed like those control rooms were very male dominated. Are there more women working in the space industry today? Has that landscape changed?
Absolutely. Absolutely has. So I've been working at the Canadian Space Agency now since 2009. So been there for quite a few years, and I can tell you from personal experience that when I walked in 2009 and I walked into meeting rooms or the operations center, it looked very different than it does today. I don't find myself anymore counting how many women there are because I can't anymore, because a lot of the times there are 50% women, or sometimes I work on teams that are all women scientists and engineers.
How exciting.
It's wild. I never thought, back when I started my career, I never thought it would ever be like this. It was male dominated. I kind of just accepted that for how it was.
Right.
But at the same time, I think that's maybe why I feel, very strongly about talking to people like you and talking to kids and talking to youth, because there's so many youth, there's so many young women and girls that are interested, and they just, because of the fact that they're told it's male dominated, are discouraged to go
Right.
in. And the thing is, now the Canadian Space Agency, we have about 800 people in the building, and we're kind of reaching those levels of representation where I think we're almost at 50% women. Yeah. So now actually one of my payloads, so we have a payload and experiment on the International Space Station, and every single person on that team. So I'm the mission manager, I have a mission scientist, and I have an operations engineer, 3 women.
That's great.
And I never thought I would have a team like that.
Yeah.
And this is like happening more and more, which is really cool. The other thing I wanted to mention, Betty, is that I never realized how important it was to have that representation. I always thought, well, I wanted to be an engineer. I wanted to work with the Canadian Space Agency. I saw Chris Hadfield. It didn't occur to me, well, he's a man, like,
Right.
oh, he doesn't look like me. He's not,
Yes.
anything like me physically. That didn't matter to me at all. That's the way I was brought up, that it didn't matter that I was a girl. It didn't matter that I'm a visible minority. None of that mattered. That's the way my parents brought me up. So I was very lucky not to have this bias, growing up with this bias like stuck in my head, that maybe I can't do it because I'm a girl. Maybe I can't do it because, I look a certain way. And I was really lucky to have parents that instilled those values in me. But I understand that for other kids and youth, you might not have somebody like that that's telling you, no, you can do anything. You can do anything you want. It doesn't matter. So what anyone that's watching this, what you need to know is that space is hard, but people are doing it, which means you can do it too. And if you believe in yourself and you're passionate about something, you just have to keep going. You just have to put one foot in front of the other. You're going to stumble sometimes, take a few steps back, keep moving forward. And there is nothing, whether you're a girl, whether you're a visible minority, whether you come from Northern Quebec, East, West, South, wherever you come from, it doesn't matter. When we look at qualifications of the Canadian Space Agency, we don't look at, oh, McGill University, this one's better. No, you just have to be qualified. You can go to any university, any accredited university, get your degree, apply. I want to see you working with me in a few years.
That's great. I think that's the best way to end this interview. That's such a positive note and such a great message. Having said that, I am going to ask you one more question before I say goodbye. Team Star Trek or Team Star Wars?
I was Star Trek. And the reason why is because every Saturday night growing up, we would watch Star Trek and Hockey Night in Canada and order pizza. And so Star Trek is just very near and dear to my heart. And Captain Catherine Janeway and Volana Torres, look them up.
Oh, I know.
Those women inspired me. And I didn't even realize, watching this show, when I was a kid, when there was not so many women in these types of positions and fields, we had captain of the spaceship, Catherine Janeway, and the engineer, Volana Torres. And I even cut my hair like Volana Torres one year because I just wanted to be her. She was so cool. She was half human, half Klingon. Anyway.
I can't thank you enough. Thank you so much, Kumi. This is great. And I can't wait for kids to watch this. Very inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun, Betty.